from the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, and a postdoctoral fellowship from the Migration Policy Center, European University Institute in Florence, Italy. His research interests lie in the urban economics and economic theory. Currently, he directs a research project titled The Growth of Cities in India, 1870 to 2020. And I think you are going to speak about the project briefly to us, right? Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So firstly, let me thank CEPT for giving me this opportunity. I've entered the field of urban studies only very recently, so there are a lot of stalwarts sitting out here, so please don't ask me too many questions. But I worked on migration for the last 5 years, and then the natural stepping stone when you work on migration is to try and understand cities, because cities are typically associated with migration. But what I've come across in this project is that you need to look at not only migration, but also a factor which actually nobody's really looked at so far, or at least that's what I think, and that is fertility. Okay, so how are cities growing? Not just because of migration, but because of birth rates. And we know India is going through this demographic transition. Families are having fewer kids. So how does this impinge on urban growth? Especially when we know that at the all India level, over 55% of urban growth is accounted by what is called as natural increase. That is just birth rate minus death rate. And yet I have not found a single work actually which sort of systematically looks at fertility rates, natural increase rates at the city, state level over time. So that's one of the sort of contributions which I'm trying to make in this work. So in this talk, I will combine two of my research interests. One is on urban economics and the other is on economic history, not theory. So this project actually looks, what we're doing is digitizing a lot of data from the censuses, and we're making a database of every city in India from 1872, the first census, to 2011. And that database should go online in about 2 years' time. So you'll have all the census information in spreadsheet format, say within 2 years. And today I'll just present some very sort of quick results from it. But I think a lot of interesting trends which question a lot of standard narratives of urbanization in India. So the first thing is that all of us in this room, I'm sure, have at some point of time in our lives written these words, either as a term paper, either as a project proposal, or in some form or the other. We always talk, or you would have read this in the newspaper for sure, that India is rapid urbanization in India. As India rapidly urbanizes, there's going to be a housing shortage. Slums are going to proliferate. There's going to be mass migration. Rapid urbanization. It's a word which resonates very well with almost everyone who works on urban issues. But there's a big question mark on what is happening in India, and is it really rapid? You have to distinguish between urban growth, which is just the cities growing, versus urbanization, because urbanization depends not only on urban growth but also on rural growth. So in order to understand urbanization, we need to understand also what's happening in the villages. So for example, if cities grow at 5% per annum, but villages grow at 10% per annum, then the country will actually de-urbanize. Your urbanization rate will fall. So it's an interplay between both urban or city growth rates as well as village growth rates or rural growth rates. So we know for sure that India actually has not had rapid urbanization, okay, but it's been a very, very slow process moving away from an agrarian society to a non-agrarian society. This is a chart which shows you urbanization on the y-axis and percentage of workforce in agriculture, and each dot on this map shows you a country. Okay, so each dot is a country, and what it shows you is this negative line, which is fairly obvious. The more urban you are, the less agrarian workforce you have. But what's interesting is the comparison between India and China from 1980. So whereas in 1980, both India and China start out at the same point in terms of urbanization and the agrarian workforce, China pulls ahead. China is in fact more agrarian in 1980, but it goes all the way here, whereas India has this very stunted sort of shift. Okay, and India's official urbanization now stands at 31%. I'll talk about the definition in a while. So clearly if you just compare it with China, it's been actually a story of not rapid urbanization, but a very, very slow urbanization, which is the first puzzle as to why is this happening. So relatively slow urbanization in India can also be seen in terms of per capita incomes. This is a chart showing you urbanization with per capita GDP. It's on the logarithm scale. And you'll see if you draw a regression line, which means line of best fit, you'll find that India is actually lower than the line, which means that at its level of per capita income, India is relatively under-urbanized. Okay, and that's because we take this number as 31%. Now, geographers claim that India's urbanization statistic is deeply flawed. So you shouldn't say 31%, it's actually 40%, because you need to count the census towns, the built-up space, etc. But even if you take 40% as a number, it still falls below this line. Okay, so the story of slower urbanization actually still holds, irrespective of the definition that is being used. Of course, there are considerable regional variations. So India's the blue line, so it moves in 1901, it's about 10%, and it's moved to 30% today. Whereas Tamil Nadu has, of course, moved from just about 15%, and it's trebled. That rate has trebled, and it's nearly 50% today. Whereas you have a state like Bihar, which goes from about 5% to 10%. Okay, so huge regional variations in the pace of urbanization, at least how urbanization is measured in official terms. And of course, so we have today about 8,000 towns, including 3,000 census towns or so. And we have 380 million people living in urban areas, whereas that number was only 26 million people at the start of the century. And the urbanization map, so this is not a cities map, it's an urbanization, which means at the district level, what is the percentage of people living in urban areas, is it also shows huge variations, right? So you have this huge cluster in Gujarat, where we are sitting right now, especially the Ahmedabad to Mumbai corridor, some sort of thing on western Gujarat. You have this huge cluster around Tirupur, Coimbatore in the south, and then you have these clusters around Delhi, Kolkata. For everyone working on urban issues, this should be fairly obvious. But you have the blank spaces in this map, which is this huge circle out here, where we are having urbanization rates of less than 20%. So more than 8 out of 10 people live in villages. Okay, so these are the sort of variations. What urbanization? So what is urbanization? It's the urban population divided by the total population. And total population includes rural and urban. So 20% means 20% of the district is living in urban areas. So huge variations out here. And if you look at, so we say urbanization is slow, but of course we know that there are some very large urban agglomerations. So this is a picture of India, the top 100 urban agglomerations today. So we take the top 100 agglomerations which exist today, okay, and they comprise of over 60% of India's urban population. And we look at how these agglomerations, what is the population of these agglomerations, not just the cities, but the agglomerations in 1901. Okay, and you'll find that Kolkata is the biggest city, Mumbai, then called Bombay, and Chennai, then called Madras, were the biggest cities. Delhi is nowhere in the picture. Okay, so this is 1901. Delhi is a small dot out here at that point, but you'll see that the triangle then was between Kolkata, Mumbai, and Chennai, right? And you have some small dots along the way. This is not a map of all the cities; it's just a map of the top 100 urban agglomerations today, and it's fairly representative of the urban population because it accounts for over 60 to 70% of the urban population. And this is a map today. Okay, so this is a difference of about 110 years, and you'll see firstly there's one new big dot on the map, and that's Delhi. So Delhi becomes the capital of India in about 1908 or 1911, and then after that, there's no stopping the growth of Delhi. So now the triangle is actually from here, here, and you have a smaller sort of minor triangle between Hyderabad, Bangalore, and Chennai, right? And you find that there's no real big red dot again in this entire space. Okay, so if you just look at big urban agglomerations, each dot is scaled by population. So you'll find that you're finding a lot of agglomerations in this belt, and again, what you saw in the earlier maps on urbanization, complete sort of vacant space out here, right? So no region has really grown to a particular extent in this particular space. Right. Another feature of urbanization in India, which is sort of maybe well known, but it's worth restating, okay, is that we know that manufacturing in India has never really taken off. Okay, it's as a share of the GDP, it's been stuck at 15 to 20%, and it's never moved beyond that. Whereas most countries of the world, it has reached 30% at least at one point of time in its history. In China, it's about 30%. So India, we have almost 65% of the GDP now coming in the services sector. And what's remarkable is that this is true even in urban areas. Okay, so this is a distribution of districts. It's a histogram. So the x-axis is the percentage of workers in the non-manufacturing sector. And what this histogram shows you is how many districts really of India have dominant service sector urban areas. And you find that virtually over 95% of Indian districts have service sector employment as the dominant mode of employment. So the classic view of urbanization, which developed in the West, always linked it with industrialization, with manufacturing. So agriculture goes down as people move to the cities to work in factories and industries. This is the classic view of urbanization. Whereas what you see in India is something completely different. Most places, the only districts which are here are Surat and one or two other districts, where manufacturing employment is more than 50%. Okay, but otherwise, most other districts of India have basically a service sector model of urbanization. And sort of the last feature of urbanization in India, so we talked of the dominance of service sector, the presence of large urban agglomerations, and slow urbanization. Another important feature which often goes sort of unnoticed is the highly masculine bent of urban areas. Just to put this in perspective, this is a map where each dot on the map represents a particular country, and you have urban sex ratios on the y-axis and rural sex ratios on the x-axis. Okay, and the line out here is the 45-degree line. What it basically means is this: most of the countries in the world you'll see lie on this part of the line, which means that urban areas are relatively more feminine relative to the rural areas of those countries. So there are more women to men. That ratio is much sort of more feminine in the urban areas relative to rural areas. And this is a. Let me see. 2010 from the UN demographic yearbook. And what you find in, so this is the world, and this dot out here is India, where you'll see that India is actually on the other side. So cities have sort of more masculine sex ratios than the villages. So it's just comparing cities and villages within each country. But if you look at the same map within India, and instead of putting each dot as a country, let's put each dot as a district. So there are about 600 districts in India. You get something like this. Okay, and you'll get that. So this is the world, and this is India. So you find most districts of India lie on the bottom side of this line. Okay, so this is not a feature of just Surat, which has a sex ratio of 690 females to 1,000 males, extremely masculine city. It's a feature of most districts of India that the urban areas are more masculine than the rural areas. And one of the major reasons this happens is because of male migration. And I'll come to migration in a bit. Okay, so we've talked about some broad features of urbanization. Just give me a minute. All right. So it's worthwhile to know what is driving city growth. Okay, and if you do a even basic class in urban demography or urban, any urban studies class, you'll know that cities grow, or any population anywhere, including this class, can grow only for three reasons. Okay, it's birth rate, death rate, and migration. Okay, just these are the three pillars of demography. And birth rate minus death rate is what is called as natural growth rate. Okay, so if you have a birth rate of 20 people per 1,000 population, and if you have a death rate of 10 people per 1,000 population, the natural growth mean is 10. 20 minus 10, 10. That means 10 per 1,000 are added to the population every year. Now we know at the sort of overall India level that if you see the contribution to urban growth, over 50% of that growth is coming from just this natural increase. So we're going to look at what is this natural growth. And this is something which I think has not been sort of explored enough. So the first fact, which is at the global level, is that if you look at the demographic transition, natural growth rates rose till the 1980s in much of the developing world and then began to fall. As fertility started falling, as people became richer, women became more empowered, you tend to have fewer kids in families. So fertility rates start to fall. So this is a map of the world, and you'll see that this is 1980, which is a tipping point for most countries, and this is India in blue. You'll see that the blue line starts falling. Okay, and this growth rate is about 20 over a decade, or over 1,000 people, so that's basically about 2%. So 2% per annum is sort of the 2.2% to be sure, is the peak rate of natural growth that India experienced, and then it starts to fall. And the fall in China is extremely steep because of the one-child policy. And then you'll see that in Europe and North America, because the demographic transition had occurred much earlier, you in fact have negative growth rates in Europe, which means more people die than are born in Europe. Okay, so this is a demographic feature of the world we live in. Now, what's happening to cities in India, right? And what's remarkable is that there's a very close connection between city growth and natural growth rate. And it's worth emphasizing this because city growth is often linked with migration. People look at city growth almost entirely because of migration. But when you see these charts, you'll realize that what is essentially driving city growth is just the interplay of birth and death. And of course, for some cities, migration is an extremely important component. Okay, so this is a chart of urban agglomerations in India. Again, the top 100 urban agglomerations representing 70% of the population. And we look at the annual growth rate of these cities, city agglomerations, between 1901 and 1951, and between 1951 and 1991, so before the reform period sort of kicks in. Okay, and we find that almost all the 100 points, okay, lie on this side of the 45-degree line. So broadly, for those who hate charts, what this is saying is that cities grew faster, and this is not natural growth rate, but actual growth rate. Cities of India grew faster between 1951 and 1991 than the 50 years before. Okay, and this is annual growth rates. And in this period, of course, you have a lot of interesting things happening. You have the partition effect. So some cities like Delhi, Mumbai grow substantially just in 1941 to 51 because of the partition. You have, of course, in any primary course on urban planning, you'll know that a lot of planned cities came up, like Gandhinagar, Chandigarh, etc., Bhubaneswar. You had industrial towns like Bokaro and steel city, etc. The rise of state capitals. And also this period, interestingly, you have the stagnation of Kolkata, which is important because Kolkata as a city, we'll see later, has had a very interesting growth sort of experience. So even in this period, Kolkata is a number here. So even before considering contemporary times, by 1960s itself, the growth of Kolkata had petered away. Okay, and this is before the rise of a lot of people like to blame the Communist Party of India to causing the stagnation of Kolkata, but you find that the growth rate had actually started dipping much before the party came to power. Okay, so as natural growth rates fell, now we know what happened at the India level. From 1980s, natural growth started to fall, which means fertility rates basically started to fall in high numbers. What you find is this remarkable aspect. We look at the same 100 top cities, 70% of urban India, and now most dots are on the other side of the 45-degree line, which means that in the last 20 years, 91 to 2001, most cities of India grew slower than in the period before. Okay, and this is, I think, worth sort of stressing over and over again, because most people think that Indian cities are growing extremely fast. But the peak growth rates have already happened. They happened in the 1980s. From every decade from now on, of course, you'll have individual cities growing extremely fast, but on average, most cities of India will be growing slower today and henceforth than what has already happened. And this is basically because of the demographic transition. For students who don't know what is the demographic transition, it's basically the idea that over time, first mortality rates or death rates start to fall, then birth rates start to fall at a lag. In between, there's a population explosion, and then over time, the population stabilizes. This is the demographic transition. And you're saying in India, by the 80s, this has already happened in the sense that birth rates start to fall. So the exceptions, of course, some of you might be knowing, are Surat, Ghaziabad, Tirupur, and these are cities basically which have grown extremely rapidly in the last 2 decades. Okay, so only in these cities do we find that they have grown faster in the last 20 years than in the 50 years before. Okay, and these, of course, annual growth rates. And you can splice these periods, however, decadal basis, 20 years to 20 years. However you see it, you'll see the same results. Okay, so this sort of contests a very popular view that cities in India are growing faster now than ever before. So you should realize that cities in India are actually growing slower than in the 70s and 80s. Okay, and that's again because of the fertility transition. And of course, in this period, you have the effect of globalization, which makes its impact on a number of cities, especially Bangalore and Delhi, but of course also Pune and Hyderabad and some of the major metros. Okay. Now here's the really interesting twist to the story. So we've talked so far of urbanization being slow. Then we've talked about city growth rates being slower than in the past. And now I'm going to call or label something as the demographic divergence. So you've probably heard of a word called demographic dividend, which means that India is now a young country. It was always a young country, but now because of the demographic transition, it's the workforce is in a very right spot, and there's a huge percentage of the population which is in the working age group. And so if this workforce is well skilled, you can reap what is known as a demographic dividend. But what we see is that actually there's also what we can call a demographic divergence. So what is this? Okay. So this is what is the demographic divergence. This is a map for India. It shows you data from 1970 to 2010. The green line is the natural growth rate. So what is the natural growth rate? Birth rate minus death rate. Natural growth rate in rural areas, which was identical to the natural growth rate in urban areas in the 1970s. But in the last 30 years, it has diverged. Okay? So you have to try and understand what is the implication of this. Okay? So just at one instance, you know why India's urbanization is relatively so slow. It's because if cities are growing at 2% naturally, villages are growing at 3% naturally. Okay? So in the absence of migration or reclassification, India is actually de-urbanizing because villages are growing faster naturally than cities. This is what it's showing. So when it's equal, then all that it takes to tip urbanization is migration and reclassification. Okay? But in the absence of that, what this difference is showing you is that there's actually a pressure on India to not only urbanize but de-urbanize. Okay? And what's really interesting is that this divergence you do not see in many states of India, especially the southern states. Okay? So these are the 4 southern states. I'm showing you the same map, same data, and you'll see that the red and green lines are basically identical. This is for Kerala, and you'll see that the natural growth rates are virtually identical. Okay? You see the growth rates for Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh. There's no story of a divergence here, which means that both cities and villages are growing naturally, natural meaning birth minus death, at the same rates. So if with some migration from rural to urban areas, the overall region will urbanize. So where is this divergence happening? Because you saw this at the all India level, but you're not seeing it in the southern states. In fact, you do not see it in Punjab, you do not see it in Haryana, you see it in basically the poorer parts of the country. Okay? Which are these states? Rajasthan with a massive divergence, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Assam, West Bengal, which always had a huge gap because of Kolkata's very low fertility, and especially Madhya Pradesh. Okay, so almost in a way the so-called Bimaru states of India, erstwhile Bimaru states of India. Okay, now this is a very important story in India's urbanization, because what this means is that how much ever migration you have, there is this feature, this phenomenon acts as a drag on urbanization. The simple fact that villages, the natural growth rates in villages is higher than in the cities. In these particular states, as you saw, there's no such difference in the southern states, but a huge difference in these particular states. Now we know natural growth rates depends on fertility and mortality. So we look at the data deeper, and we realize that actually there's no differences in mortality rates across these states. So what's driving these differences is essentially fertility difference. So there's a huge gap between rural and urban fertility rates in these areas. What explains that? We dig deeper, and we find that almost all this difference can be explained by differences in female literacy rates, which is one of the most sort of basic predictors of fertility rates. So urban areas in these states have seen very good improvements in female literacy rates. That I'm talking within these states. Right? So in these states, the cities have shown extremely rapid improvements in female literacy rate, much more than the villages. As a result, fertility reduction in the cities has been much faster than in the villages. As a result, these states have actually urbanized, or the pressure to urbanize is extremely slow. Because even if you have mass migration, just the villages are getting more people per year than the cities. Okay? So very interesting feature of urbanization in India, this north-south divide, and within the north, this divergence between rural and urban areas. So what are the likely causes? As I said, basically differences in female literacy rates. And the implications of this is that you have slower all India urbanization, and you have a lot of regional variation. Okay? Now, the funny aspect of this is that urban growth, so there's a difference, urban growth and urbanization. So urban growth is just, you take the number in 2001, take the number in 2011, and see what has been the change. Typically, you'll find that urban populations have grown. Okay, but urbanization, as we said, was urban population divided by the total population. So there's a difference between urban growth and urbanization. So you can have extremely rapid urban growth and de-urbanization. Okay, if your urban areas are growing at 5%, but the rural areas are growing at 10% per annum, then you have 5% urban growth, but you'll have urbanization falling because rural areas are growing faster. Okay, so what we're finding is that because of this demographic divergence, you have extremely slow urbanization in the north, but you're also going to find high urban growth in the north relative to the south, purely because of higher fertility rates. Okay, so we need to understand fertility, and that's what this map does. Okay, so this is a map on fertility at the city level. So this is no longer the state level. Okay, and we proxy fertility by some indicators called the child-woman ratio, data coming from the census. And the sort of reddish numbers indicate higher fertility, and the sort of yellowish numbers indicate lower fertility. It's called a fertility index. And what you find is a clear north-south divide, okay? And the differences are quite stark. So we're saying the fertility in the north is almost twice as high as in the south, which means you can forget migration. Just the differences in fertility across cities is going to be driving much of the intercity variation in India. And this is fertility data from 2011, which means it's a good predictor of variations in the next 10 to 20 years. Okay, so a sort of key finding coming out from this project is that you're going to find a lot of relatively much more rapid urban growth in the north relative to the south, but much more slower urbanization in the north than relative to the south, because in the north, even the villages are growing very fast. Okay. You'll notice also on the map that Kolkata actually has one of the lowest fertility rates. And then we've been sort of trying to understand this feature more. And it seems to be a really persistent feature, because Kolkata had one of the lowest fertility rates among cities in India, even in the 1950s. Okay, so there's a lot, it's a very complex city in terms of understanding fertility. But otherwise, the divide is very stark. It's a clear sort of north-south divide. There's some sort of difference in terms of the major metros, but otherwise, especially in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, which are at the peak ends of the demographic transition, those cities are going to grow much slower when you just look at natural growth. Of course, if people from the north start migrating to the south, which is happening, then you could have some differences. Okay, so we know that fertility differences exist, but we know that from 1901 to 2011, okay, in each decade, barring one, the urban population has grown at a faster rate than the rural population. Okay, so now we just solved that from 1970s, the natural growth rates in urban areas have been smaller, but what this chart is showing is that the actual growth rates have been higher. So this can happen only for two reasons: migration and reclassification. Okay, so what we then next are going to talk about are these two factors. So we looked at fertility, we looked at natural growth, and now we're going to be talking a bit on migration. And a lot of interesting things happening there as well. Okay, so this is a chart of urbanization on the left, and over the last 5 years I've been working on migration. So this chart is coming from that research, but it's based on National Sample Survey data. And this is a map showing you where people are migrating from India in 2008, but pretty much today. And it busts a lot of sort of common myths. Okay, so one common sort of explanation is poverty is a driver of migration. Turns out that the two states of India which have the highest rates of out-migration are Bihar, which is the poorest state of India, and Kerala, which is the richest state of India. Okay, so it's a very interesting sort of phenomenon that the poorest state of India and the richest state of India have the same rates of out-migration. Of course, people from Kerala are not going to Bihar, they're going to the Gulf. Okay, so that is a difference. And people from Bihar are now moving to Kerala in order to fill up sort of jobs which are being left vacant. But you'll see that it's not just a Kerala phenomenon, it's actually an entire West Coast phenomenon. So a lot of my work has been trying to understand why this feature persists. And you'll find that this map is pretty much identical even in 1901. Okay, so this is one of the things which I've written about called migration persistence, as to why migration patterns have persisted over the last 100 years. And this is, so you have a district like Ratnagiri, which had mass migration 100 years back, it continues to have mass migration. And this mass migration has a very specific feature, especially this particular map which I'm showing you. Uh, it is male dominated in nature, which means that mostly men are migrating, and that is why you get masculine urbanization. So you have a lot of male, excess sort of male workforce in cities. And the second aspect is that these working men in cities send back a lot of money home. Okay, so there's a lot of remittances. So this is also a map on the remittance economy of India. Okay, and I've quantified the remittance economy at various levels in other work, but you'll see that it's basically Eastern UP and Bihar, the Himalayan states. Actually, this map does not show you Nepal, but it's basically the entire Himalayan range. If you had data on Nepal, you would see that it's just the entire Himalayan sort of economy, which lives on remittances today. If you go to Uttarakhand, it's called a money order economy. Okay, so most people working in Delhi and so on. Also, a large part of sort of northern Rajasthan and coastal Orissa. So this is a place which I have studied. I spent a lot of time trying to understand Surat, and Surat, which is not too far from here. And Surat is a city which draws migrants from sort of all over the country, but especially this district called Ganjam in Orissa. Okay, so a lot of people from here, this cluster is migrating to Gujarat. This cluster out here is migrating again to Surat for in the diamond industry. You have clusters in this belt, different. So this is a map showing you out migration. Most of this map is showing you migration within the country, but for example, Kerala is showing you migration outside the country. How does it matter for urban studies? It matters because this migration has two key features. The male domination in this migration stream, which means you get masculine cities, but also it's highly semi-permanent. It's not seasonal. They're not migrating for 2-3 months. They're migrating for 10 months in the year, but they're not going to settle in the city. Some of them will, but most of them don't. Okay, so people, migrant workers in Surat, for example, will work for 10 years, maybe 20 years of their life, but they will die in their native villages. And this has huge ramifications to understand urbanization, because what we're then talking about is very large numbers of gross migration flows, but very, very small net migration, because people are also going back. Okay, so this is and what we estimate in our contribution to urban growth is only net. So people say migration in India is very low, because if you look at the numbers, it's very low contribution to overall urban growth. But that is always a net number. Okay, but if you look at the gross numbers, it's substantially much higher. So a lot of people, so there are incoming cohorts and there are outgoing cohorts. Incoming cohorts in the age group of 15 to 25, and people who have worked for 10, 20 years and are now going back. Okay, so a huge story of networks, social networks in driving these migration flows. And you'll also see that this map is on almost inversion of the other. So you have this blank space of urbanization here, and you have this huge chunk of out migration from there, which also tells you that how urban spaces which are not urbanized or not urbanized too much, don't have a major urban agglomeration, have a huge connection with the migration, out migration story. Which brings me to my sort of second concept, which I'm trying to sort of articulate. So one was demographic divergence, and the other was remittance urbanism, which means that a lot of cities of India, I estimate about 30% of India's urban population, exhibits a particular kind of urbanism, which I call remittance urbanism. And what does this mean? It basically means that these cities exhibit huge, highly skewed sex ratios, huge proportion of men. The migration is semi-permanent, and the city pretty much lives on remittances being sent away. So city is living on the migrant workforce, but the migrants are sending money back. So it leads to remittance economies back home. Okay, so this is a kind of, and I call it remittance urbanism, because urbanism is like a way of life in urban areas. Because if you see and if you talk to migrant workers, the whole focus is to earn money to remit. It is almost like I'm coming to the city not to enjoy the city, but to support my family back home. Right? So that is why I call it a remittance urbanism. And you'll see that it's highly correlated. So it's a tough graph to explain. These are age groups, okay, and this is the correlation coefficient between different migration indicators. Okay, so you see that migration does not affect sex ratios in the child age groups, because obviously kids are not migrating in large numbers. But you find a particular kind of migration, the ones which yield remittances. These are migrations which do not yield remittances, and these are migrations which yield remittances. It is those remittances which are highly closely linked with this male-dominated aspect. So it is a particular kind of migration, which I call remittance-based migration or semi-permanent migration, which leaves its imprint in cities being very masculine. Okay. Just to understand a bit more on migration patterns, this is a sort of heat map which shows you for each city, how is it drawing migrants from? So where are the migrants coming from in each city? Now this data is a bit dated in the sense that it's showing you for the period 1992 to 2001. Okay, so a lot of things have changed, but I would argue that broad patterns still sort of remain true. So for Mumbai, you'll see why it's called the most cosmopolitan city of India, because you have people coming from pretty much every corner of India, but you'll also find these networks, right? So there's a complete blank space here, and then suddenly Eastern UP is a huge cluster. Okay, it's very difficult to explain geographically, because typically migration is inversely related with distance. So you would expect this space to have more migrants, but you find that the further you go from Mumbai, you get more migrants. Okay, and it can be explained by networks, historical migration, etc. And interestingly, again, that this migration map of Mumbai has not really changed much since the map of 1901, which I'm trying to develop. So I will have the 1901 district level map soon, but you'll see that there's hardly any difference. So districts like Udupi, Ratnagiri, which send a lot of migrants to Mumbai, continue to do so. A lot of the Udupi restaurants that you see is a manifestation of that out-migration. Delhi, at least in the 1990s, was drawing in migrants mainly from the Hindi-speaking plains. You have Kolkata then, suddenly we'll see that there's hardly any migration from most of the other parts of the country. Okay, so it's basically just a small hinterland around Kolkata. And for Surat, again, you'll find that there's a huge cluster here. And one district, this district called Ganjam, which again sends in a huge number of migrants to Surat. This brings me to city sex ratios. This is from, again, 1901 to 2011. So 110 years of sex ratio is basically females per 1,000 males. And you'll find that these four cities, about 15 to 20% of India's population, Delhi, Mumbai and Kolkata start out basically as male towns. Okay, so we're talking of almost 80% of the city just being men. Okay, and that stabilizes over time, partly because there's some more female migrants coming to the city, but also because of natural growth. So if you have at least a few daughters being born in the city, the sex ratio will stabilize, mathematically speaking. So that's why these numbers stabilize. But even today, if you look at the migration numbers, over 80% of the migrant workers in these cities are men. Okay, so this is a huge gender component to understanding urbanization in India. And Surat, you'll see it was balanced, but it went down in the last 40 years as migration kicked in. As Surat started growing very fast, the sex ratio plummeted. Okay. So what are the implications of this? One, you have slower net rural-urban migration because people are not settling, they're coming, working, and also going back. You have masculine urbanization, and you again have north-south variation. So you have much more balanced sex ratios in the south than in the north. The last component of understanding urban change in India, we've looked at fertility, we looked at migration, is this very interesting feature of what we call as reclassification. And if you've been reading the newspapers, you know that this is a huge issue now because the last 2011 census threw up some 2,000 or 3,000 more census towns. So all of you hopefully know what is a census town. It meets the criteria of what the census thinks it's urban, but its governance is not urban. So it's still a Gram Panchayat, but it's met some criteria, 5,000 people, 400 square kilometers, 75% non-agricultural. Okay. Now, one thing interesting out here is that there is a huge incentive in India for a Gram Panchayat not to be classified as a municipality or a Nagar Panchayat. Okay. And you see this more in particular states than others. And this is basically because of it's because of public finances. The minute you convert yourself to a municipality, you lose funding for NREGA, you lose funding for a lot of schemes which the center or the state provide in the name of rural development. You should know, for example, that though we say there's an urban bias in a lot of policies, historically till now, if you just look at the funding given by the Ministry of Rural Development versus total budget of Ministry of Urban Development, that ratio is something like 95:5. So there's much more money at the Rural Development Ministry than at the Urban Development. The population ratio is 70:30, but the funding ratio is 95:5. Right? So obviously, it makes sense to stay rural, even if you're a population of settlement of 10,000 people, 15,000, some places only 100,000 people, and it's still called a village. So this is one reason why a lot of villages still remain on paper as sort of not governed by any urban local body. But there's also one emerging issue which we found when we were sort of analyzing the data, is that the recent census did not, in our view, capture the employment statistics very well. And we believe this is because of a reporting error caused by the NREGA. So you find that a lot of the number of laborers in India has been inflated massively in a lot of parts of India, especially in those parts where in villages everyone got a job card. So wherever, if everyone got a job card, then you ask what is your employment, a lot of people returned the answer is Mazdoor, because the question was asked if, do you have a job card or not. So irrespective of whether you worked in NREGA or not, you were classified as laborer. And we sort of see this. We compare, this is a percentage of households holding a NREGA job card, okay? And you'll find that in certain regions of India, okay, almost 80 to 90% of households got the job card, the NREGA job card, okay? Whereas in some other parts they didn't. And there's a very close relationship between that and what we call as the annual growth rate of agricultural laborers, okay? So the very, very close relationship between where NREGA job cards were distributed to everybody and the annual growth rate of laborers. How does this matter? Because what the census will take in 2021 to classify census towns will depend on this employment data. Because one of the criteria of employment is 75% of the sort of workforce should be non-agriculture. But what you are seeing is that India actually became slightly more agrarian between 2001 and 2011, which is a bit ridiculous when you look at data from the national sample surveys, etc. Okay, so this is important because what you'll see actually in 2021 is that a lot of towns could be reclassified back as villages based on census 2011 employment statistics, which we argue is slightly misleading. So this is also sort of an emerging issue with respect to census towns. But there's no doubt that a lot of census towns in India need to be converted into urban local bodies. So I'll just wrap up here. Two themes coming out. This is still very preliminary research. For those who came in late and those who sort of like to work with numbers and data, this project is trying to digitize a lot of information at the city level. So we're trying to build a database of every city of India from 1870 till now, every census here. And it should be freely available online in maybe 2 years' time. Right? But if you're interested in working on various aspects of this project, that would be, you can just feel free to write an email to me. But what we're finding right now, these two themes, okay, so north-south divide in pace of urbanization, and this concept of remittance urbanism, and the significance of census towns. So we are left with this paradox today that we have rapid urban growth in the north because of higher fertility rates, but slower urbanization in the north because of higher fertility rates even in the villages. You have slower urban growth in the south, but rapid urbanization in the south. Okay, so this is, I'll leave you with this sort of paradox as to how we can think of urban growth in India. And this obviously has some implications for urban planning. If you want to know which cities are growing faster, maybe your job prospects are tied with it. Faster the city grows, the more the housing stock, more demand for urban planners, urban designers. So you need to be in the north because that's where the cities are going to grow relatively faster. But obviously, if I'm not an expert on these issues, a lot of experts sitting out here, but population is in a way is what you start with, right? You look at any city and you say, how big is it? And you have to work everything around it. So it's useful to know what's happening in India in order to design this. So I'll stop there. This is some of the work which I've been working on. I'll be happy to take questions, comments, criticisms, anything. Thank you.
How this study, that entire study that you're conducting, what is the end product that, apart from digitization and numbers and looking at the urbanization scenario and this divide that we are
Sure, yeah.
observing?
So there are 4 key objectives. One is, of course, forecasting. You need to have some idea of how cities are going to grow in the near future, and I think that's one of the things which it might be useful in sort of forecasting. I have till date not really seen any work on fertility in India cities at all India level. So that is hopefully one contribution. But we're trying to tie this up with economic growth. So actually, since I'm a trained economist, the starting point is to try and understand how is economic growth linked with city growth in India. Because there are a lot of theories which say economic growth naturally translates to city growth. So what is the relationship between economic growth, what is called as human capital externalities? Is it the fact that cities with higher educational institutions or better institutions in certain sectors tend to pull in more people, etc., etc. What I've shown you today is city growth as measured by population. What we're also trying to develop is city growth as measured by economic output. Obviously, we don't have data from 1870 for that, but hopefully for at least 2-3 decades. So then we can actually measure, because that could be different. Right? You can have Lucknow, which is growing very fast because of fertility, but not because of really economic output growth. Whereas you have Surat, which is growing fast on both counts, population as well as economic output. So the overall aspect, so the broad project is framed in a way to understand the relationship between economic growth, human capital and sort of city growth as measured by population. So that's the sort of final aim. Yeah.
That is what we are talking about as an urbanization. The corridor.
Correct.
If you just put up that corridor on your map, it actually, and the project doesn't seem viable at all. I mean, it goes in, we are talking, it goes in a very different direction.
Correct. Yeah. So I think if you think, this is a classic question in regional planning. So if you want to really plan cities, where should you put them on the map? So I think, and the answer is quite very clear, because you need to put it in the blank spots, not to where people places are already there. So I think that's one factor. Yeah.
So why is Kolkata having lower fertility rate?
Yeah. Anyone from Kolkata? Chandrima from. I'll answer that. So it's a bit tough to answer a question on a city where I have never really been. So I have to be very, very cautious in trying to answer this. But from what one can gather, Kolkata does have one of the highest female literacy rates in India. Okay, so they've done extremely well on ensuring that all girls go to school and all girls go to college, etc., etc. So that is because that is a fundamental predictor of fertility rates in India. You look at any region, the minute you have female literacy rates which are very high, you have fertility rates falling. So that's one simple answer. But female literacy rates are almost identical in Mumbai and Kolkata. So what explains Kolkata's lower fertility rates? And what explains the fact that this was lower even in 1950? I think that's a question that needs to do, that you should do your PhD on, or it's a big topic. But I think some people might have worked on this, because I've read a newspaper article on this, but I was not very convinced by what they were trying to say by that. Yeah.
Is it dangerous for India that people are leaving their farming jobs?
Yeah. What's the question?
Is it dangerous for India that people are leaving farming jobs?
Yeah.
Are you only taking questions now in order to discuss?
No, I can take them. I can answer them on the spot, no? And I'm just noting them for my personal record. That's all. Is it dangerous? I think if people are, leaving farms because of a massive agrarian crisis, then it is a problem, right? Because you don't want to have that. But the classic way urbanization took place was with an increase in agricultural productivity, leading people to leave farming not because they had to, but because they wanted to. So there's a big difference between those two kinds of leaving farming, right? You look at any national sample survey today, the result is very, I wouldn't say bleak, but it's very clear. There's a direct survey in the national sample survey. Do you consider farming viable? Do you want to leave farming, etc., etc.? And most farmers in India want to leave farming, right? Now, there are different interpretations of this. Some call it the agrarian crisis, but there's no agrarian crisis in many parts of India, and still people are leaving farming. So I would see it as a very inevitable process of urbanization, which has occurred in most places of the world. You see urbanization within India, right? And you find that people have left farming in Kerala, in Karnataka, as a proportion of the population. So you should see it, I think, as an inevitable phenomenon. It is actually a problem if you're finding that people are not leaving farming. For example, in Bihar. Right? And then you need to understand why is it that people are not leaving farming at all? Because there are no opportunities, because that leads you to a diverse set of factors. But that is, I think, a more scary scenario if India is still urbanized at 30% 20 years down the line. It has to be more than 40%. Yes.
First of all, thank you very much for giving an excellent and a very simple presentation that somebody like me who is scared of graphs could understand. I work in gender and the built environment, and I'm extremely interested in the phenomena that you mentioned about masculinization of the cities. Because I would have thought that happened in the colonial times. I mean, I'm quite surprised that it is. So I was wondering, I will of course look up your article but I was wondering if there is some work that you come across which also looks at the social consequences of this phenomena.
Yes, so I have one paper which is not on this list called Missing Men, Migration and Labor Markets, which looks at the impact of male out migration on the regions, source regions. So I look at how the economy changes and so on. There's not much work done on impact of male migration on the cities themselves, what is happening to the city. But I think the reason for the persistence could lie, it's a chicken and egg problem, but could lie in housing. So what you find in these cities are enclaves which have been designed only, for example, for men to share. So you have these bastis where only men will share the apartment. So if you ask migrant workers many times, why have you not got your wife to the city? They say, where will they live when there's so many men around? Because there's no privacy in this particular enclave. It's almost like a men's hostel block. So how will women live there? And precisely because in colonial times it started off that way, one explanation could be the persistence of these housing enclaves. In Surat, for example, it would be almost impossible for any woman to live in a particular male masjid there. So how do you break this? One answer is maybe sort of better housing where you incorporate this sort of idea of gender balance within those bastis. I don't know if I've answered it. In terms of work on gender in the city, I'm sure there's a lot of work, but maybe I need to sort of read more on that. Yes.
I think there's one or two important questions. Now, first of all, let me explain where I'm coming from. Yes. I haven't looked seriously into this subject after the mid-1980s.
Okay.
So in a sense, I have come here to refresh myself on what's been happening since. But one of the things that I find missing in the discussion, maybe because it'll come into your next part of the study, but it is important here too. And that is, what is the kind of employment? You talked about manufacturing, non-manufacturing and all that, but beyond that, there's a whole question of formal or
informalization and so.
Formal sector or informal sector. Increasingly, the tendency is for employment, even in better paid jobs, to move away from formal sector to informal sector. Yes. So that is one thing which I think needs to be taken into account. Secondly, if again I go back to pre-1980s, there were studies on migration, different streams of migration done by Ashish Bose.
Correct, yeah.
Which talked about, I think, how many? Six categories of migration, which are divided into short distance, medium distance, and long distance. Now, what is the picture with those today? Because he talked about short distance migration being mainly women getting married and moving away. So it would at the most be from one taluka to the next taluka.
Correct, yeah.
Then, whereas the long distance migration would be for men going to the big cities to seek employment. The other thing where you talked about, when you answered this lady's question, you talked about there not being the kind of places where women can live, and so you came straight to housing. I think before that, one has to realize that there is a very major informal sector in housing.
Correct. Yeah.
Which houses all the migrants who come there.
Yeah.
And the traditional pattern has been that initially it's the young men who migrate in search for jobs, and only after they have stabilized do they bring the women folk.
Okay.
So I don't know how much that picture is changing now. I'm a little bit aware of what's happening in Surat. But I don't know much about what is happening in Delhi or the areas around Delhi, for example. So these are some of the... And the third thing I'd like to point out is that in many of your maps, you pointed to the blank areas, which are roughly a belt running from slightly southeast to slightly north, slightly southwest to slightly northwest. I think these are traditionally... areas which have low density of population and high level of forests and they're natural. Of course, those are themselves in a very perilous condition, but that's another story. So, what is the future of those in the present picture of migration?
Thank you. All excellent questions. first kind of employment. So you're right, I've not talked about that. There's no doubt that India's still continues to have, 92% of India's workforce is informal and so on. And that is a very important part of this urbanization story. So even the fact that, I don't think it's maybe linked with the service sector story. But with informalization, what's interesting is that, so for example, when I went to Surat, I had this very classic notion that informal labor is bad and formal labor is good. It was ingrained into me. I don't know how, but somehow. And when I went to Surat, I found a lot of people who were moving away from salaried jobs, who had salaried jobs as peons or clerks, but were getting into, say, diamond cutting or power loom industry, different parts. So then I've come to realize that what really probably matters is the economic dynamism. So maybe it doesn't really matter of this formal-informal divide, but it's an intriguing aspect as to why India still retains such a high workforce in the informal sector, and why India still retains such a high workforce in the informal sector. It could also be in terms of the nature of hiring people. How do people hire? It's hugely network-based, and that sustains that informal economy. So that's why you have industries where only migrant workers from a particular part of region come, because they solve the information problem of the employer-employee, because they can assure the employer enough employees at any given point of time. But the employer wants it to be an informal relation, because the employer gains tremendously by having it informal. So I think this informality is closely linked with this migration network. That's one possible explanation. About migration patterns, have they changed over time since the 60s, 70s? Of course, there have been some changes, there's no doubt. But for example, in this paper, the regions which have been sending migrants, what's interesting is that the destinations have changed. So for example, in Ganjam district, 100 years back, they were going to Burma. From Sivaganga, they were going to Malaysia or Sri Lanka. Today, they go to different regions. So from Ganjam, they're going to Surat. But the same regions are sending out migrants. Some new have arrived, but the old ones have not gone away. And this can be only explained with this gender story of only males going and coming back and perpetuating it generation after generation, so that when you grow up in those areas, migration is very normative. You expect that you will go and also come back. When you ask migrant workers, they know that this is how it is for them. It's almost like migration, almost like a culture. But there's no doubt that there are more women migrating in India than before as a percentage of overall women outside of marriage. So almost every adult woman in India is a migrant on definition terms, because the minute you step out of a village due to village exogamy, you're a migrant. But going beyond that, there's no doubt that women migration has increased, especially from Chhattisgarh. So from Chhattisgarh, you're finding a lot of difference in that. The informal sector and housing, yes, definitely. So what I was mentioning relating to housing enclaves was also within slums. So even within slums, you have male enclaves where you won't see a woman for a huge part of the slum. So that is to that as well. Stabilization of women coming in up. So are women coming to the cities? Yes, they are. But earlier, for example, in Ashish Bose's work, he would say something like, it will happen over time. So for example, the sex ratios of Mumbai and Kolkata have stabilized, which means more women are entering. But when you look at just the number of migrants in a city, it's almost over 70%, 80% in these cities are still male. So that stabilization is taking place extremely slowly. And you also have, because of this demographic transition, a huge young workforce, which is also predominantly male who are migrating. So the overall numbers don't seem to change. The blank spaces, yes, Madhya Pradesh for sure has, traditionally forest cover, terrain, etc. So that can be explained. But a place like Bihar, which is a plain and, which is that space, yeah. Even spaces in Rajasthan. Yes, for correct. Correct. Western. Yes. So there, it's interesting because there, the prospects for agriculture are sometimes bleak. In Madhya Pradesh, actually, agriculture is doing very well. But in sort of this Gujarat border, maybe not. But what's interesting is that, in a way, they've been locked out of the migration network. Because if you see the migration map, these networks have been very stable over 100 years. So to break that network is very difficult. And because Madhya Pradesh was not part of this network, one of the reasons why this network starts is actually from times of indentured labor. So when colonialists picked up labor, they picked up from certain regions. And those regions, even after indentured labor was abolished, the migration didn't stop. People still went out in different places. And so Madhya Pradesh was actually never active recruiting ground. So it never got into that migration network. So it's tough for people to get into that migration network. So I think that the development story of Madhya Pradesh might be completely different. Yeah, any more questions?
things that he spoke about earlier was the difference between the net migration, rural to urban migration, and the gross rural to urban migration. So it's been well documented that the net rural to urban migration in India is slowing down over time. But what I'm curious about is the gross migration also slowing down, or is, as the workforce gets younger, or as the young workforce increases,
Correct.
is the gross migration increasing?
Correct.
Or
Excellent question. And I believe Amitabh Kundu was here last week or something. So I differ with Professor Kundu on that particular point on declining mobility. He's been saying this for the last 15 years, that mobility in India is falling. And he looks at the migration rate from the census or the NSS and male migrants by male population. Okay, that number is, firstly, it's falling extremely slowly. There's really no story of declining mobility, but it's not increasing for sure. So he's made this argument, and he's got one more argument on, he's computed net out migration rates at the state level, and he says that they've not changed much. Look at Kerala. Okay, male migration rates have barely budged between 1990 and today. Okay, this is a period of mass migration for Kerala. Why has it not budged? Because when you come back from Gulf, the census will ask you a question: are you a migrant? In theory, you are, because your last place of residence is the Gulf. In practice, nobody says that. Okay. And we can document these differences because you have something called the Kerala Migration Survey conducted by CDS, and they find that the return migration rates are massive because almost 20% of the workforce in Kerala is in the Gulf. So if you look at the census figures, it shows you male migration rate has not changed. You look at a completely different way of measuring migration, and its rates have doubled. So this is basically an argument on methodology. I have not abandoned, but I have shifted the focus of migration numbers from in-migration, which is what Amitabh Kundu and the census is talking about, to out-migration. The map I showed you was on out-migration. Right? Look at the numbers on out-migration. Census does not collect information on out-migration. It does not ask you who is away from your house. Right? It asks you, are you a migrant? So it finds out how many migrants are within a particular place. The NSS, for the first time, they have many migration surveys, for the first time asked a question on, are you a migrant, in 2007-8, and they had a similar question in 1993, but they said, are you a migrant who has left within the last 5 years? So I've compared those two things, 1993 and 2008, and you find that out-migration rates for work have doubled. So I'm very convinced, and because out-migration is important because it covers both international and internal migration. It does not cover immigration from Bangladesh or so on, but it covers a lot more of migration, which just the census does. Okay, so in migration rates, Professor Kundu is absolutely right, it's barely budged, but he has never looked at out-migration. And out-migration rates, especially for work, the NSS shows you that these are double. So if the question is mobility in India falling and so on? I don't think so. It's a short thing. It's a methodological sort of debate. And I'm convinced that migration in the last 2 decades has increased. Mobility for work has increased as a proportion of the population. Keeping in mind that in a lot of regions, it has been persistently high. Okay, so even in Bihar, there's been no change because even in the 90s, it was very, very high. But in a place like Kerala, the numbers have doubled. Okay, in a place, or even a place like Ganjam, what globalization has done is that it has triggered a lot of more migration streams. Okay, so regions which had extremely high migration rates before 1914, when the first wave of globalization ended, we often talk of globalization from 1991, but India was a fairly globalized country with migrants all over the world, etc., before 1914, the First World War. And the trade to GDP ratio falls after 1914 and so on. So the migrants, you see the out-migration ratios then, and you can do that using destination country census, etc., were fairly high. Those same regions then, it fell across the 20th century and picked up after 1991 or over the 1980s or so. So short answer, mobility has increased. In regions which it has been persistently high, it has increased only nominally. There are some new regions like northern Rajasthan, a lot of people go to the Gulf. Those are sort of some new changes which are happening. But most of this migration continues to be male dominated. And that is the real puzzle, or you can call it worry. So if I have to take a normative stand, I would say that this migration is not healthy. What we need to promote are policies which not prevent migration, facilitate migration, but facilitate gender balanced migration. So we want more women of India to move to the cities. Yeah, sure.
It's just a quick clarification I wanted. So just one
Okay,
quick
I'll just take that and
clarification.
come back. Yeah.
The out-migration figures are out-migration for all kinds of areas or only for rural areas?
You can compute it at urban level, rural areas, yeah. And it doesn't. So again, not a paper here. There's a paper called Remittances in India, Facts and Issue. That's freely available online. And there's one table out there showing you state level out-migration rates for work, pretty much, both rural and urban. You'll see it has increased in rural areas as well as urban areas, internal migration streams as well as international migration streams. So in all four kind of categories, these out-migration rates have increased. Yeah.
Thank you.
You said that when you educate females, they tend to think like men. Like they are going after opportunity, they are having less fertility and...
No, so the short answer is no. I don't make any such statements. What I'm trying to say is, I'm not saying this. It's the most well-documented, robust relationship that you have in fertility studies. High female literacy rates, low fertility. So that's just a simple relationship.
How do we explain fertility? Like a number of women and number of babies are related.
Average number of kids born, it's a very you can have a number like 1.6, which is very awkward. But that is how, there's a rate called total fertility rate. What I have used is called as a child-woman ratio. So you look at children in the age group 0 to 6 divided by the women in the population 15 to 44. That is the classic fertility sort of ratio.
So you have not related in this in any manner with women who are working in a city and men who are working in a city.
So that's a good point. So maybe I should have mentioned this. So along with masculine urbanization, a unique part about India's workforce in cities especially is that women's workforce participation, work as defined as outside the home typically. It's not that women are not working at home, but how the NSS defines work outside the home. These rates are extremely low. It's about 12%. Okay, when the average in most countries is about 30%. So this is also, and maybe it is linked with masculine urbanization, which means that the spaces for employment are simply not there. Okay. The other thing, of course, now this is a bit of labor economics, but what you find in India is this remarkable aspect that as you become richer, females withdraw from the labor force, right? Except at the very, very higher ends of education. So there's an inverse, but that inverse kicks in at a very, very late stage. So if you're very poor, you have to work. If you've reached a bit, then you don't have to work, so you withdraw. And that keeps happening across income classes, except education classes. It's only the extremely educated who then come back to the workforce.
And same kind of difference between cities and rural, because we have this impression, okay, I don't know if you're, because in rural economy, either it is informal or you have an opportunity to take a break and come back to it easily.
Correct.
Men and women are both working in fields or in agriculture, and in cities it is not so. So in cities, women work
correct. The female workforce participation in rural areas today is about 30 to 35%. In urban areas, 10 to 15%. So these are the stark reality. A bit of that is definition. But you're right, in the sense that, again, from my own field experience in Surat, it's a fear of the woman stepping out of the house to go for work. The X number of things that can happen on the way. Right? So that is one thing. And when I asked women who did work for some time but who were not working there, I said, why did you stop working? They said, now we've reached a particular class level. So now there's no need to work. Right? So that is the classic withdrawal from the female, from the workforce. But it's an important part of the process of urbanization. Yeah.
As India's economies boom and grow, are you seeing any difference in migration patterns due to economic necessity and economic choice, rational economic choices? Is there any reduction in migration due to forced economic necessity? So the difference between I have to go
correct.
And I want to go.
Yeah, correct. Thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, what migration scholars call it as pull or push factors. You know, the classic, the two factor, pull factor or the push factor, which is more sort of dominant. But I see it as two blades of a scissor. So there's really no simple answer to that, because you wouldn't migrate if you did not have something at home, and you wouldn't migrate if you did not have an opportunity there. So it's always a combination of both. But if you pushed me to emphasize on one, I would say that there are more opportunities probably in variety of sectors today, which is driving a lot of migration, not necessarily of the distressed kinds. For example, the world's largest government public policy is the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. As part of the act, it's a stated objective to reduce distress migration. right? So that is, it's a policy, it's enshrined in law. So the government is trying to reduce it, what it calls distress migration. Now, how do you define distress migration is very challenging, right? Because what is distressing for some may not be distressing for the migrant themselves. But anyway, and the distress migration is very closely associated with seasonal migration, which is extremely short term, 2-3 months of the year, when the off season of the agricultural calendar. But, the migrant workers of Surat will never work in a NREGA scheme, because the NREGA is for the poorest of the poor, whereas the migrants in Surat are not the poorest of the poor from the villages they come from. So the public policy which wants to check migration is the migration of a very different kind. So what you'll see is that as people, so one hypothetical sort of situation is that suppose you belong to an extremely poor family and you have to go for seasonal work. You can't go for long-term work because you don't have the money to stay in the city for 10 months. So you have to go only for 2-3 months. And then you come back. Now you have NREGA policy. So you have an income source. Over time, suppose you become rich, you start migrating again, but for longer periods. So you have then a switch from seasonal migration to more long-term sort of remittance-based. So the way migration patterns are changing, I think, is that a lot of seasonal migration in India is becoming a bit more long-term, in terms of both duration as well as distance. So that is one sort of change, and you see a bit of that in the numbers. But the seasonal migration map of India is actually very different from the migration map I showed you. It's concentrated it's overrepresented in areas with more sort of Adivasi population, with more Dalit population. It's the poorest of India. So it's naturally clustered in certain pockets. I have a map for that. It's not on this presentation. Yeah.
There's also a difference in patterns between where the agriculture is more cash crop based.
Correct. Yes.
I have a very nice, lucid presentation. I think put things across very simply. Interesting observations. A couple of clarifications which emerge from what I understand. You seem to have ignored the tier 2, tier 3 kind of settlements, and the references are always rural as frozen and the metro, and all the phenomena seem to be examining that too. But for example, the maps do not indicate the distribution of smaller towns. Maybe because you're shown blobs of the metro.
Correct.
But let's say in Uttar Pradesh, maybe there was no big blob, but they were maybe more distributed, small-sized urban settlements.
Yeah.
Now, does that start changing the way you explain? Because as of now, it seems you're talking about rural as if frozen from time that I've known to now, the status have not changed.
Correct.
But if you say there's a natural increase in population and hence the status of rural constantly changes definition, and the entire things is more dynamic than what it seems to appear. So that is one clarification I seek. And second is the urbanization and the reason for it, or the status of a town of going from, let's say, a trading city to a manufacturing to a service economy to a knowledge economy. Does that have a role in the nature of migration? Because again, the migration you seem to be discussing is from rural to urban, but what about urban to urban?
Very good. Yeah.
And I think if those nuances started coming in, so then you start probably knowing why, from which state and what category starts migrating. So as of now, they all seem to be clubbed as one. And I thought that that kind of detail would help us really appreciate the kind of migration one is talking about. And third is giving those details. For example, you mentioned about Udupi Shetties going to Mumbai. But that happened with the Land Acquisition Act, where overnight all the zamindars realized that they have lost all the land and they were so-called unemployed and made this massive rush to Mumbai. So a lot of these phenomena of why certain things happen in a certain area would explain migration as against a very generic kind of a thing. So I don't know whether you say it is too complex and much beyond the scope that you're interested in, hence that you have sort of generalized, or do you think these have been incorporated, probably not presented?
Yeah. No, I mean, excellent points, and there's definitely stuff out here which I will take as constructive feedback. Let me start with the small towns thing. So you're right, I showed you the top 10, 100 urban agglomerations. But this project, that was because of just better visual clarity. It's very tough to show a map of 1,000 points, 5,000 points. I do have something in the appendix. Sorry, this is again. But broadly, what I'm trying to say is that if you look at just fertility, and if you look at the basic indicators which I'm talking about, the patterns which hold, for example, the north-south divide, are true whether you look at the top 100 agglomerations or whether you look at all the towns and cities of India. So that's one analysis which we've done, because we have a database of both the urban agglomerations as well as the towns and cities individually. So that's, and what we presented is just for sort of better visual clarity. But what's interesting, of course, is that fertility varies by settlement size. So the bigger the city, there is lesser fertility. In the sense, it's almost like economies of scale with respect to fertility. Okay, so the bigger the city. But having said that, the regional factors outweigh. Okay, so if you see towns around Delhi, for example, or even Delhi, for example, has a fairly high fertility rate. Okay, even though it's a very, very large city. So there are some regional factors, okay, the female literacy factors, which are affecting these things. But the broader point of looking at tier 2, tier 3 cities, that is something we definitely do. We look at growth rates across the board, so all the towns and cities, and the broad things coming out here. City growth rates in India have peaked. That holds true whether you look at the top 100 urban agglomerations or whether you look at all towns and cities. Rural as frozen, so this is something I'm going to keep in mind. I should not sort of articulate that. Again, very good point. I think to some extent this reclassification business is about that. Appreciating the fact that villages are growing, at some point they're going to tip over. So we do estimate, we have some estimate of 2021, how many more census towns can come, etc. Because the data exists. We have the census 2011 data to make an estimate of census towns in 2021. So that's something. So we're not really looking at rural as frozen, but yeah, I should keep that in mind. Type of city and migration. That's a fantastic point, because I've never really thought about this. So for me, most of my fieldwork is in Surat. Lived in Mumbai and some other places, but maybe I have had an experience of a manufacturing city bias. And as I showed you, most cities of India are not manufacturing. So it could be that migration patterns of India substantially vary by the functional type of the city. So this is something I've never thought of, and so this is something that I really need to look at. Regarding other factors driving migration, I say there are 3 core factors which drive migration in India. One is density. The reason why Bihar and Kerala, poorest and richest states of India, both have the highest rates of outmigration, essentially density, in terms of the number of people per square kilometer, not of land, but of arable land. The land-man ratio is, extremely sort of, the density is very high in both these states. So density, number one. The other reason driving outmigration is actually climatic factors. Okay, so you mentioned land acquisition for Udupi, but actually my experience, and I'm from Udupi, is that most of the migration from Udupi, the mass migration, starts with the flood of 1920s. And you'll find a lot of areas of India which have had massive events which are very impinged in the cultural memory of those places, because of which migration is very, very important. For example, Ganjam district in Orissa, super cyclone almost every 8 years. So in that kind of a situation, migration is a very stable stretch. Or Bihar, without sort of proper irrigation networks, always floods. I'm not saying always, but most of the years it floods. So what's the use of having a very good plot of land when it's half submerged? So these sort of floods, cyclones, droughts in some areas have led to a migration psychology in many parts of India. And the third being just history in itself. So why the colonists picked migrants from certain areas have linked these migration networks over time. Why Ratnagiri continues to be a migration hub is because the first people who went to Bombay as laborers were from Ratnagiri. So density, history, and climatic factors, I think, are extremely important to explain out-migration. But there's no doubt that the abolition of zamindari, some other factors linked at particular points of time could be.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
I think there is one more factor which perhaps, unless it's already included in these categories that you mentioned, but the distribution of land holdings by size. No, because you have typically in Bihar and UP, let's say, at least in eastern UP, you have very small land holdings, and then you have some people with very large land holdings.
Correct, yeah.
So in fact less productive than large landowners.
Correct, yeah.
And the push factor at work there is that those with small land holdings don't have enough to support even their
Correct.
household needs.
Yeah.
So they have to depend on labor and
Correct.
going as seasonal migrants to a distant place is more beneficial for them than working locally as
Correct.
laborers.
No, I think land holding size is very important. Just again, from what I know, I don't know much about this topic. In Ganjam district, for example, or even Ratnagiri, so it's a nice comparison, coast to coast. You find in remittance economies extreme fragmentation of land holdings. And that is because people want to hold land as status, but not to actually grow any crop. So you want to hold that, so you never let go of that land because land has that status value apart from economic value, but there's nothing growing on that. So because the essential source of income is the remittance income through migration. So from these districts which I studied extensively, I've always wondered why people don't permanently sever the connection. But there's this huge attachment with land, this other reasons as well. But they're not really growing anything. So one interesting hypothesis could be that extreme fragmentation of land holdings has led to outmigration, which then furthers more fragmentation of land. So that's something, which is worth sort of checking up for sure.
I'm a bachelor student pursuing, I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm a bachelor student pursuing urban planning. My question is that now the government policies are moving from a slum clearance to slum friendly, slum upgradation and slum beautification policies, in situ upgradation. So is it an incentive for migration, or are there any studies being done that slum upgradation and slum friendly policies have been an incentive for migrants to come to cities?
Yeah, that should be your thesis topic. I think you should ask Professor Darshini Mahadevi. She's the expert on this. Short answer, I don't know. I've never seen any work on this. And I can just say theoretically. So theoretically, yes, there'll be more demand because you're getting houses for free or low cost. So why not get in more migrants? This is, of course, there's a lot of debate on this in the public finance literature, because why should you provide public goods when people are not paying for it? Right? So that is a classic question which is often asked. So if you can devise a system which sort of taxes people also for using that service, then economically maybe there is a sort of case in which it can lead to more migration to avail the public service. But in my experience in places which have high slum densities and so on, I don't think this would matter. This change in slum policy broadly. Will people get more of their friends and relatives to avail these things? It's a possibility, but you really have to sort of collect some information on it. So short answer is I don't know. Yeah.
I think that was a beautiful presentation in my opinion. I have one comment and two questions.
Sure.
One comment was regarding Professor Kundu's talk. When he was here, he had made this statement about the urbanization being exclusionary. In the sense, he didn't say that urbanization itself is exclusionary, but the tier 1 cities or the big cities, the way they're urbanizing, they are exclusionary. Therefore, he had said that probably what we need is a more decentralized kind of tier 2, tier 3 urbanization. The questions are, one is related to the paradigm question. Vandana Shiva was here a few months back, and she had basically raised this question that why do we have to move people out of agriculture? Now, as a paradigm, are you saying that the urbanization paradigm is the way to go, or can that itself be questioned? It is actually a little blasphemous to ask that question sitting in this place, because we are about urban planning and all that. The second question is about the female literacy rate that you mentioned as the proxy to the fertility and all that. Could it be that the question about Calcutta and the southern states, the divergence. Could it be that it's actually a pet hypothesis that I talk about because I come from the South Indian state? Is it that the social reform and the political reform that happened in these states, actually it happened quite some time back and it has been happening, that the difference between that and the kind of feudal political structures or the hangovers of that is there in the northern states and society, is that the key difference? Because that is what then led to the female literacy and the education, and then is that a reason? Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, thanks for the one question and two comments. Exclusionary urbanization, the thesis by Professor Amitabh Kundu, is linked with the statistic of declining mobility. So if you have declining mobility, it must mean because there's exclusionary urbanization. So if you contest the thesis of declining mobility, then you have to contest the thesis of exclusionary urbanization. So that's the short answer. There's this whole discourse that neoliberal policies of India in the last 20 years have sort of made cities in the global city image, and it's not very inclusive of people. You're having road widening projects and so on, which is there. There's no doubt. There's some of it exists. But if you see the migration numbers at these cities, it's still intact in the sense that the same rates are happening. Things have not changed. Some cities like Surat has been phenomenally high. It's the fertility rates which are falling, but the migration numbers have sort of not really changed much. You also have to make a difference between, again, gross and net migration, right? So how many people actually coming to the city? If you make an argument for exclusionary urbanization, which Professor Kundu does, but Professor Kundu does it in the context of the last 2 or 3 decades, I would argue that urbanization in India has always been exclusionary. Because people, this thing of people coming to city and going back has been happening since the first census, 1872. Right? So a thesis of exclusionary urbanization is tenable, but that it is an artifact of the last 2 decades is not. You either say it was always there, or it was never there, that sort of a thing. So Vandana Shiva's paradigm, if she's going to live in a village, then yes, but I don't think she does. And this is a problem with anybody who makes a claim for rural subsistence, not subsistence, but sort of, why can't we just have people living in farms doing agriculture? There's a very simple reason for it. Agriculture is manual work. Your back pains when you do it, so nobody wants to do it. You want to sort of get into work which does not hurt your back. Of course, you sit at the computer, it pains sometimes, but it's a very different kind of work, right? It's a very simple case for urbanization, right? In the sense that there's a case for agglomeration. People want to live in areas where there are more people, right? That is the number one reason. I can bet you, if you take a survey here, out of I don't know how many, 30, 40 people here, your life, if you came from a village or out here, most of your life will be spent not only in a city, but a top 5 city of India, which means by population, top 5. Okay, which means, or maybe top 10. Okay, why? Because you want to live in a place which has a lot of, that's what we call as agglomeration externalities. So when we talk of even decentralization, Professor Kundu is not going to move out of Delhi, right? Because there are a lot of benefits that Delhi gives, right? This is the fact of agglomeration. So one has to be very careful when one makes sort of statements when they themselves are not going to do it. So, and you have to be doubly sort of skeptic about that. Social reform, very good point. I've not thought about it. One interesting hypothesis, not linked with migration or anything, which has been proved in a way by the India Human Development Survey, which is conducted by the University of Maryland and National Council for Applied Economic Research. They asked a question which proxied for untouchability. They asked a question basically, would you allow your domestic maid to enter the kitchen? It's a question to proxy untouchability. And they found that the lowest rate, so the all India figure is 25%. So 25% of India practices untouchability. The figures are less than 2% in West Bengal and Kerala. Okay, so it's quite a sort of obvious tribute to some particular policy which have happened there. Very strong social reform movements in a particular sectors, right? How does it matter for fertility? It could, but I am very skeptical. Why? Because you would also then expect some changes in female workforce participation. So if this hypothesis is right, that the social reform movements have led to sort of more female empowerment, you would also expect more female in the workforce. But you don't see that. You see a bit of that in Tamil Nadu, but in Kerala you have extremely low fertility rates, But the workforce participation rates are abysmally low even in Kolkata, abysmally low even in Kerala, which is supposed to be the best state for women, right? So it's not being it's being reflected maybe on some parameters like untouchability, which is not gender related, or at least not necessarily gender related, but we don't see it in these other parameters, right? So then I don't think maybe that's a very important factor. Okay, so any more questions, or maybe we should wrap up? Yeah. Thank you.